disinformation campaigns. So I picked up on some things there. Okay, I want to go to start. So, the building resilience and complex. So complex in this case essentially means hybrid plus compound. Compound is kind of a cyber attack in the midst of an ongoing natural disaster. This is a very interesting graphic. Which is more powerful, the AT-47 or the movie camera? What's interesting is from RT. And then there's the cyberspace, and then Bend is something that Catherine Carley from CMU has put together. So obviously information can have lots of effects on the resilience, some positive, some negative. You can have inspirational leaders, you can have data-driven decisions, cyber attacks, negative cyber attacks, interruption, disinformation. But we're talking about compound threats here is how do you use information disruptions to increase the impacts of concurrent events like natural disasters. So if you have, and then the complex environment, now we're talking about essentially information-related hybrid threats, as we've seen from Russia and China and whichever. So 6 parts to what is resilience, how does information tie into resilience, what do we mean by complex systems, and the term that NATO uses now is information-related hybrid threats. Then this, the natural factors of the age of acceleration, as Tom Friedman describes it in the 4th Industrial Revolution, as Davos talks about, are actually making the ground more fertile for these kind of disinformation campaigns. How do you counter them, and then how do you organize, train, and equip? So for resilience, this is using Judith Rodin's definition from former head of the Rockefeller Foundation. It's capacity, it's not a plan, it's not a program, it's not a strategy. To prepare for disruptions, recover from shocks and stresses, and adapt and grow. So the 2 critical concepts here are capacity and then adapt and grow, and we've synopsized this, how do you prepare to bounce forward better? It's a graphic most of you have seen, but basically you want to wind up stronger at the end than you were at the beginning. How do you again, bounce forward better after the stresses and shocks? There's an interesting dichotomy here between security and resilience. People talk about cybersecurity, for example, compared to cyber resilience. And resilience really is about, security is basically about locking up and hunkering down, whereas resilience is much more about achieving an organization's goals. You assume the bad thing is going to happen to you. And so how do you keep fighting even after you've received damage and wind up being stronger? So the resilient capacity is something that leadership must do. This is not something for the CISO. This is not something for the chief resilience officer. The leadership has to be encouraged at all levels. Make it a core characteristic of the organization to be nurtured. Make it sustainable. In the business language, business literature talks about making this a positive business asset and resourcing it accordingly. So treat it as something that will make you money. And then again, building an enduring capacity of the organization. The adapt and grow, Tom Friedman, modifying Darwin, talks about it's not the strongest, the smartest that survive, but the most adaptable. How do you learn from the stresses and shocks and change? Remembering that no lesson is ever actually learned until behavior changes. And then Nassim Taleb's anti-fragile, things that benefit from shocks, like certain kind of hedge strategies for straddles for mutual funds, things like that. I guess you need agility in order to analyze the shocks and respond. So a cyber resilient organization has got to be part of an organization that's resilient overall. You can't be cyber resilient in and of itself. And, welcome, please. So since we have some new folks here, why don't we just quickly introduce ourselves around? Just go ahead and introduce yourself for a second.
I'm Kiritoshi Ozuma. I'm the president and CEO of a national security startup based in Japan called Resilience Japan. And Dr. Wells, right here, is a special advisor to our company. And we promote the concept of resilience, especially cyber resilience, through business engagement with the Japanese government and major Japanese companies. And we train Japan's indigenous cyber force using the capabilities this Washington, Virginia, and Maryland can bring to the table. So it's very nice to meet you, and this is my first time to be on GU campus.
Alex Brodsky, I'm a professor in the computer science department. I work on decision guidance and optimization systems. And many applications, in fact, we are looking at what we call resilience in markets, especially in the area of power. So I'm kind of curious to understand the connections.
I'm Kathy Lasky. I'm a professor in systems engineering and operations research, and I work with Professor Lynn Wells, and I am Associate Director of the C4I and Cyber Center, which is sponsoring this seminar, and I'm also the Director of the Center for Resilient Sustainable Communities, which is a new university center of which Lynn and I are primary people. I guess you're not officially faculty, but primary people associated with.
Luckily, Drs. Wells and Lasky both need very little sleep.
But I need more than I get.
I'm Tom Clemens. I teach in the systems engineering department. I teach a course in C4 ISR.
I'm Mark Boland, Director of the C4I and Cyber Center.
I work here. Sorry.
Gets things done.
Great.
I'm Dan Weiss, and I'm president of a company called 4IR Microgrids. We're focused on powering communities and universities in Africa, United States.
So just repeating here, the Cyber Resilient Organization has got to be part of an organization that itself is resilient. And while cybersecurity contributes to cyber resilience is much broader than security. Cyber attack chain, most of you know, reconnaissance the target, weaponizing the payload, delivering the payload, exploiting the system, installing what you want to do, controlling it, and then acting on the objectives. That's been pretty well standard for a long time. Again, the point here is going to be less on cyber security and cyber resilience than the resilience to information attack. The OODA loop, many of you know, the Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, which of course was put together originally and based on fighter combat in Korea, where the observe and orient was you looked out of the cockpit and you observed the target and you orient yourself to what it was doing. You decided and act all within one person. Problem now is that nearly all the orient and observe phases are done with electromagnetic sensors. Decide and act is in present information processing. The point now being that cyber can dominate the OODA loop in all domains, land, sea, air, space spectrum. When you implement tech changes on top of this, there was a very interesting Army Science Board study a couple of years ago that looked at the battlefield in 2050. And obviously there are lots of uncertainties there, but the question basically was, in a world of extremely ubiquitous sensors and very precise weapons, could you move on such a battlefield and not die? And it's ambiguous, and it's not clear that you can. And if in fact you can't move on the ground battlefield, or for that matter, the surface maritime battlefield, what does that say about our entire concept of military operations? The other point of here is speed of decisions. The Air Force has been talking for some time about human on the loop rather than human in the loop. DoD likes to say we want to have a person in the loop at any key decision, particularly lethal decisions. The problem is the velocity of machine warfare at this stage is if you wait for your network graph to change from green to yellow, you red, you've lost the fight. So you have to be delegating to the machines some kind of action to be taken at machine speed, and how do you make those delegations? I thought one of the really interesting things the other day over in the hub was this business about explainable AI or trusted AI or whatever. And the whole question is, at what point will DoD ever be able to trust AI to make lethal decisions? And fits directly into this. And then if we don't, then suppose other people do. So there've been clearly been a number of real world important attacks. How many of you know about the Aurora generator tests? Okay, in 2007, Department of Energy did a test out at Idaho National Laboratories on, and it's called Aurora. And basically it's a picture of a generator. Of course, the generator, and it's a film of the generator. And on the rotating part of the generator, that normally takes a little bit of magnetic impulse to keep it spinning. So what they did basically is took those magnetic impulses and put them 60 degrees out of phase with where the rotor was any given time. And in about 2 minutes, the generator just totally destroys itself. You can just watch it tear itself apart. So this was one of the first really serious examples of physical destruction by a cyber attack. Right, that's replicated shortly after Stuxnet and the Iranian nuclear system. Shamoon took down large amounts of the Saudi Aramco computers. Of course, the Iranian power grid was dropped twice beginning 2015. Navy's Task Force Cyber Awakening took a look at the vulnerability of shipboard systems based on a combination of extensive tests, but also some real-world penetrations of Navy systems. And the Task Force Cyber Awakening came out with a very good plan for cyber resilience. It's worth reading. It's all unclassified. One of the points it made is that the state of your electrons is just as important as the fuel in your bunkers or the weapons in your magazines. And this is a command responsibility. It's not the responsibility of the communicator or the J6 or the whatever. It is a command responsibility. Dyne distributed now service attack obviously had, I think that's still the largest DDoS we've seen, and had all sorts of spin-off effects on the internet that people didn't expect. WannaCry versus the UK Health Service, Meltdown Spectre introduced hardware and firmware. 2018, the Congress put some legislation in talking about the need to rethink our cybersecurity and supply chain security. Should we reshore the production of secured chips to the United States? It's still ongoing. Then this year has been a dramatic increase in ransomware attacks on cities. The latest one last Friday is Johannesburg was taken down. So if you look at a resilience analysis, typically the cyberspace attacks are the 5 Bs: deny, disrupt, degrade, destroy, deceive, increasingly being combined with IO and kinetics. If you just look at the industrial control systems and SCADA, supervisory control data acquisition, there are so many attacks. Linda and I go out to DEF CON, the hacker convention, every year in Las Vegas. They've already found 200 plus vulnerabilities in the typical human machine interface for the average SCADA system. And you can read the others there. The interesting thing about this is that this is an OT-IT problem. The OT being the operational technology like a generator, and versus an IT problem like the internet. The problem is when the generator goes down, the tech is going to reach for his multimeter and a wrench, not look at cyber issues. So you have a massive cultural divide between the OT and the IT people. Increasingly, as the critical infrastructures are becoming more and more vulnerable to cyber attack, you're also having this cultural issue you need to cross-train. And then the compound threats I mentioned is cyber during the course of environmental disasters. So one of the models we've used to analyze this is the thing we're calling a resilience quadrilateral. And the nice thing about this is actually done by some folks in the University of Manchester. But if you look at the phases of the disruption, post-disturbance, restorative, you can quantify this. So this B is how fast the system degrades. Say this is power grid, how many lines are shed per hour, say. And the lambda is how low does it go, the epsilon is how the extent of the downtime, chi is how promptly does it come back. Then our model, we've added 2 new variables, beta, how much better does it get, and tau, how long does it take to get there. So you can actually quantify these things and go look at, all right, I have a system I'm going to make very robust so it's hard to crash, but does crash, it'll be hard to bring back up, or one that's very agile that could go down easily, but I can bring it back quickly. And actually by measuring the area under the curve of the degraded power, evaluate the different strategies. So for the center, Kathy mentioned the Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities, CRASC. We tried to tie together a whole batch of things. And one of them is a focus on the community, So there's a sociological component here, what does resilience mean in different communities? One is global knowledge sharing. We have this global Star Tides network to bring together all various expertise from different communities and different locations. Innovative economics, the economy is working for you, you don't need this, but if not, what's some alternative models? How you tie together the platforms from energy, shelter, water, food, comms, nutrition, with other things like the narrative to tie it together, but also geospatial and logistics and finance and this sort of thing. And then underpinning the whole thing is governance. You have to have a governance system that works. So, so one of the things that CRASC does is bring together the technical analysis of various issues with the sociological analysis of how the people are going to be part of it. And the key part of this here for the university research and teaching is we're using the term transdisciplinary to refer to integrative research that brings together research across multiple disciplines in ways that generate new knowledge. But then the transdisciplinary means you have to have practitioners on the ground who know what's going on. So it's not just totally an academic exercise. So now how does this fit together in complex systems that we're calling information-related hybrid threats? So these are all complex systems relationships. You've got a social plane, you've got an information plane, you've got a communication plane, you've got a physical plane. So to what extent are servers stored in the basement of buildings inside below the floodplain? To what extent are your network topologies stored? To what extent are the information systems, the data storage, the applications, the APIs, and all that secure? And then how do the people actually respond to what's going on? So you put together models. The models only need to model these different planes, but you have to look for intervention targets which can actually make a difference in the collective outcome for greater resilience. Cognitive emotional conflict. There's been a fair amount of talk about cognitive conflict, which basically says you've got to not just look at the zeros and ones, but think about how it's affecting people's minds. Rebecca over at NRL talks about the importance of emotional. I think it's very important. A lot of these decisions, cognitive implies rational decision making, and a lot of these decisions are based on emotions that have to back that in. In cases where the adversary is now been directly targeted, political processes and systems. Again, not just cognitive. How do you build the resilience out of your system, out of your company, out of your organization, of society? And then, if you're going to have a conflict where the center of gravity is not tanks, troops, arty, and command posts, but again, the minds, mobile devices, the citizens, how do F-35s and BG-51s and tanks fit into that defense structure? Are we really spending our money on it? So this is from Frank Hoffman over at National Defense University. Talks here about low probability of war, higher probability of occurrence, and this is level of violence. So the whole batch of areas things here called measures short of armed conflict. And this is, again, interference in election, it's the little green men in Crimea, it's a batch of things that don't really fall into armed conflict, but they certainly are part of the conflict today. And then it ranges from terrorism, irregular warfare, hybrid, all the way up to major war. So this cognitive emotional conflict really covers the entire span of this area. So this is actually from Mark Laity, who's the head of strategic communications for NATO. And he talks about Russia's new concepts. So from the Russian journal Military Thought, an entirely new environment, expanded from ground, sea, and air, information environment. No goal will be achieved unless one belligerent gains information superiority over the other. And then from General Gerasimov, you hear a lot about the Gerasimov doctrine. It basically talks about achieving all the goal of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goal has grown, and then talks about the importance here of the informational conflict. Bill Studeman, who's the former Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, Director of NSA, argues that the U.S. has really misplaced its focus on cyber. The Russians, to some extent the Chinese, focus on information. And so, which cyber is a subset. And so his point is that we're focusing on the zeros and ones, the technical pieces, The Russians are playing a much longer game in terms of focusing on the information, which affects all aspects of society. So the question here is, going back to this RT point about which is the more powerful weapon. A lot of people talk about entering a post-truth era where there is no objectivity, only approximations by as many different voices as possible. The Russians are doing this all the time. Look at the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner in Ukraine. And immediately they think, well, it was shot down by the Ukrainians. Well, actually, it was filled with bodies before it left, and it was crashed on purpose to set up the Russians as a scapegoat. Or it was actually, well, 5 or 6 different explanations offered in the first 24 hours or so, just to confuse the image so nobody really can say with certainty this is what's going on. And it's interesting, this quote here, there is no objectivity, comes from the editor-in-chief of Russia Today, now called RT. So this goes back to Hannah Arendt. People from the distinction between fact and fiction, truth and false no longer exists. It's just exactly the way you'd like to be. Not just Russia. China has this thing called the United Front. The United Front brings in other entities besides the Chinese Communist Party. For example, the kind of Federation of Economic Organizations and things like that. It's one way to tie different messages together. Three warfares doctrine was approved in 2003. Psychological, media, and legal. Lawfare is an interesting term. There's some very interesting work presented in Macedonia about the extent to which the Chinese are working against, working in favor of Duterte. They're manipulating the information campaigns in the Philippines in favor of Duterte very much in the same way that the Russians have been doing it in the West. So going back to this graphic for CRAS, basically it's an information campaign directly can target the community focus, the social piece, the economic piece, and the governance piece. So it becomes a critical part of resilience, even in the CRAS piece, even though we've been thinking more in terms of how we take care of jobs and economic opportunities and this sort of thing for different communities. Interesting point here, this is actually taken from NATO. How does the narrative becomes absolutely crucial. Notice down here, narrative is one of the absolute core parts for CRAS, and part of understanding what the community is trying to tell you and conveying to them a message that comports with their values and standards. But also in this case, the narrative is key. In this case, this is kind of NATO's founding narrative. So the question is, you go through one of these things, any kind of a model, what narrative are you trying to convey? And one of the real problems some of the people I've been working with who have been dealing with countering the election interference is what today is a coherent narrative that you could get agreed upon across the United States, or for that matter, across Europe. And then how does it tie into a higher level narrative? Who's the audience? Are your words aligned with your actions? This is actually not new. General Eisenhower was the first SAC Bureau back in 1952. Talked about putting information strategy at the heart of all levels of policy planning and implementation, integrating it together with practical effective strategies. Right now, if you look around the world, most people would say it's the Russians and the Chinese who are doing this much better than we are, but there's nothing new about this. This goes back to the early 50s in terms of the original concept of what the US was trying to do and the West was trying to do in the campaign against communism. So there are two factors that are likely to exacerbate actually to make more fertile the fields into which counter-information, disinformation campaigns can head. Tom Friedman refers to the age of accelerations. And one of the points here is that it's changing the structure of risk. Trust is declining in almost everybody, government, business, experts, for a number of reasons. Lots of recurring incidents around, and social media are reinforcing it. The point is declining trust. With Davos, Klaus Schwab has laid forth this idea of the fourth industrial revolution, which is also raising geopolitical risk and changing the market. So the industrial revolutions are 1780, basically the application of water and steam to looms and factory work. 1870 or so, application of electricity, divisions of labor, and mass production. The 1960s and 70s, what we call the information revolution today, and what they're calling the fourth industrial revolution, which is just beginning, is the fusion of technologies that blur the lines between physical, digital, and biological spheres. This is really, really important. And the distinctions are the velocity of change, the scope of the change, and the systems-wide impact. These are going to transform not just production on the factory floor, the way we manage things, and by and large, it appears they're going to provide very significant collective benefits to society. It's going to grow the whole pie, but it's going to negatively affect many individuals. Almost every study you see talks about the job market bifurcating into a few high-tech, high-skill jobs and a lot of low-tech, low-skill jobs. And how do you address that from the standpoint of politicians, stability, economics, whatever? The responses have got to be public, private, whole of government, transnational, comprehensive, and integrated, which we have not shown a particularly skillful way of doing in almost anywhere. Superimposed on this, the volume of tech change. Most of you have seen this before. Basically, if some parameter, computing power per unit cost, doubles every 18 months. In 5 years, the increase, in a year and a half, it's 100%. In 5 years, 910,000. 10 years, 10,000. 15 years, 100,000% change. Now, this curve can level off. There might be a step function, just continuity of quantum computing. But the point is, a linear projection based on where we are now cannot possibly be accurate. In addition, you've got these interactions. Biotech is changing even faster than information. Robotics are becoming ubiquitous. Nano is poised for breakout and everything from materials to energetic explosives. Energy impacts everything. So I like to think in terms of brine, bio, robo, info, nano, energy, to which I now add artificial intelligence and adaptive manufacturing. Again, the interactions compound the problem, but the point is linear projections just cannot work. These trends cannot be controlled by governments. They're happening largely outside the control of governments. Government can influence. So how do we need to think about restructuring our national security strategy, our culture, and our organizations effectively? More and more actors are playing importantly. More and more individuals at the edge of the network are being empowered. One of the key points here is that almost all of our decision-making structures were basically evolved alongside the Second Industrial Revolution. When you had time to write a memo and be in a meeting and so on and so forth. How do you now address governing or businessing, whatever, when you have this information changing this fast? In addition, the trends support the hybridization of warfare, going back to that curve, more things that the measures short of armed conflict, but also the combination of cyber and kinetic and civil and military together. Many more people are going to be part of the conversation about their future. We're at 50% penetration of the world's population by the internet right now. So how is that going to, how do they get a vote? They do get a vote, how do they play in? And we talk now about cognitive emotional conflict can affect most anybody. And there's some fundamental questions being addressed another time, but what does it really mean? Who we are, what we are, talking about all these ability to bioprint parts of our bodies or grow them in different species or extend lifespans or whatever. What does that actually mean to be human at some fundamental ethical, moral conflict or conversation? All right, so how does this tie, how do you then counter some of these information-related hybrid threads that target the kind of seams in society that are being generated by these economic and technical approaches? So Kathleen Carling talks about social cybersecurity. And in this case, cybersecurity is hacking machines, involves data denial, capture, destruction. Social cybersecurity is hacking people, right? Capturing hearts and minds. Science, it's a science part to understand cyber-mediated changes. There's an engineering part as to how you build the systems to do this. She has this model called BEN, I'll talk about in a minute, But basically, you first have to ask yourself who did what to whom with what impact across the various systems. So in traditional information warfare, you've got one group trying to dismiss or distort, twist the facts. The other group is trying to induce fear, distract, create a different narrative. That's kind of what you typically think of as information warfare. The new environment is basically narrative and counter-narrative. And so, and what she has postulated in this bend is that you've got a series of positive and negative effects. So if I am trying to boost the importance of a particular idea, the other side will be kind of neglected and make it seem unimportant. If I'm going to try to bridge gaps to make it reach out and become all inclusive, the other side is going to narrow it down to make it seem very specific. If I want to back it and emphasize it, the other side will try to neutralize it. There are different ways to make some matches. If I want to build it, nuking, you just try to totally destroy the idea. If I want to enhance the value of the point I'm trying to make, the other side will dismiss it, and so on and so forth. So the way this ties together, her model is BEND. The acronym doesn't make, the BEND is not an acronym per se. BEND is just this combination of, in the community, there's sort of positive things, build, back, boost, and bridge. There's sort of negative things, they nuke, neutralize, neglect, or narrow. Similarly, in the narrative, the knowledge network, the positive piece to enhance, explain, excite, engage, negative, dismiss, distort, dismay, distract. So rather than just having an information campaign, you now have a much broader set of narratives and counter narratives that we need to be thinking about how to engage in, going back to this model of who did what to whom with what impact across all those dimensions now. So the trends in the disinformation campaign, there's a Professor Nitin Agarwal, who is actually from the University of Alabama, Little Rock, who has done an extraordinary amount of really good analysis sponsored by DOD and DOE and DHS on tracking blogs, tracking YouTube, tracking whatever. There's very specific ideas about who's doing what to whom. So the cross-platform orchestration basically says almost all these sophisticated campaigns use multiple platforms. For example, a number of young people get their information today from YouTube, which can give you a pretty good in-depth conspiracy theory or in-depth argument or whatever, but they're narrow and don't reach many people. So what's happening is Instagram, which has become the social media of choice, is then used to amplify, to broadcast the YouTube. So I put up a YouTube with a point I want to make, and a whole bunch of people blast out on Instagram, and that's how I get the word out. Communities and coordination, there are blogger communities, there are all these blog farms, coordinated clickbaits, just like, you know, the CNN tries to get to click on a whole series of stories. So there are a whole series of very sophisticated efforts to try to get you to, you know, go farther and farther down the rabbit hole into some of these narratives. A lot of coordination by flash mobs, and then manipulation of the algorithms within the Facebook and other things to raise the, or Google to raise the importance of the story when it comes out. And these are some of the books that they published down in, Arkansas. Some are NATO. So what they did is they looked in great detail at what's been done in a series of NATO exercises, ranging from Dragon Ride and Trident Junction in 2015 up to this last year's Trident Junction and this year's Baltic operations, to actually understand what was done with regard to NATO narratives and so on and so forth. They're also looking at the disinformation campaigns in the Asia Pacific, particularly in the Philippines around Duterte, and then the Canadian elections are also, which just happened last week. So what they found, a little hard to read, but so some of the leading anti-NATO narratives. NATO has negative environmental impact. Right? Mocking, ridiculing NATO. There was a great, striking ad for a Trident Juncture that showed a picture of a Pampers package with a NATO pilot on it. So, you know, it's on one hand seems silly, on the other hand, it's that sort of thing. There's also another narrative that shows is very suddenly NATO officer in his uniform, and the counter narrative is a picture of the 4 of the NATO defense ministers, all of whom are women. And juxtaposed on it is a picture of Minister Shoigu, who's kind of this, you know, in his Russian hat and everything, looks like a very, you know, macho military guy. Now it turns out, I'm told, that in Europe it had exactly the opposite impact, because the Russians figured that you look at this Russian military man and say, boy, that's pretty cool. The Europeans looked at it and said, wow, we got women involved in the decision-making process. And so the message was, but anyway. NATO threatens stability, NATO disturbs local economy, NATO troops mistreat our people, go ahead and stop NATO protests, NATO's aggressor, NATO's broken the Russian barrier for no purpose, NATO's a joke, it's not a real threat, so on and so forth. So these are the kind of messages that have been put out over the past several years, specifically in response to those NATO exercises. This comes back into Argowal. Blog Trackers is a website here, and this is really a very sophisticated program to look at blogs, see who's blogging about what, which appear to be botnets, which so on and so forth. Then there's another one on YouTube, again, to figure out where the YouTube stories are that the most read, Instagram, and so on and so forth. Also, there was Sandia. And Sandia has this thing called Dynatica, which is actually a social-cultural behavioral influence model. So they're actually looking at what is the impact on the population of some of these messages, and that could be good for us to tie into some of the work we're doing. So how do you organize, train, and equip for all this? I think one of the key points here is how do you prepare for the war, not just the battle. The Imperial Japanese Navy on December 7, 1941 was brilliantly prepared for the battle it was about to fight, and completely unprepared for the war that engulfed. So as we get into a conflict that's involving hybrid information-related threats, are we prepared to fight that conflict? Are we still trying to build more fighter planes to fight the war we'd like to fight, as opposed to the conflict we'd like to get involved in? Defending about this is certainly going to require collaboration. On the cyber side, you've got to share the threat data, both within the government, public-private, government-to-government. Obviously, a security problem, but that has to be addressed. Collect the meaningful data, focus on the cyber resilience and mission assurance in the traditional cyber sense. But then also, you've got to understand the information-related hybrid threat environment that you're working. You can't just be enough these days to put together a good cyber security or cyber resilience problem. It has to be an information and cyber campaign. So how do you detect the cross-platform orchestration, figure out what communities coordination is going on, and then use kind of the bend-like approaches to look at the narrative and counter-narrative. There are a lot of opportunities on the cyber side. Task Force Cyber Awakening has put out a series of points on ways to mitigate 85–90% of the threats you're going to face. Actually, the Attorney General of the New York, one of the counties in New York, has put out a free cyber security toolkit that any small business can, again, get to about 85% of their security by using this. And then in the hybrid area, first of all, people have to recognize the awareness is growing. If you have not looked at the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence review of 2016 Russian election or interference in our elections, it is much, much more detailed than the Mueller report, and it specifically details very precise voter suppression campaigns targeted about very precise subpopulation, Blacks, Hispanic, women, young people in particular zip codes to suppress the voting. And then there are tools that are becoming available. I'm sure there are many more. I just haven't had these ones I've come across so far. Blog Tracker and YouTube Tracker, Dynatica, the campaign planning using Ben. And then realize that you can't go into this as a pickup game. This is a long-term competition that needs to be addressed. So what does a resilient cyber organization look like? It starts from the top. This is not something you can assume is going to happen. And it's not the responsibility for the CISO, or not the responsibility for the SIX or for whatever. You have to have somebody take responsibility for it. Be skeptical about everything you see. Resist complacency. An interesting point that the private sector uses, or some private sectors. However, whether you're doing move the goalposts every 3 years, just make it more, set a higher set of standards, because the technology is changing out from under you, and just because you're doing really well in the system you set up and you think you're working, recognize every 3 years or so you'll need to move the goalposts. Anyway, so there's some thoughts and questions. Welcome, sir.
Well, I'm not totally optimistic about where we're going with cyber, but information warfare strikes me, as you've identified it, this is the real problem. And it seems to apply to the whole population of the nation, not just to the military.
Exactly.
In fact, it probably applies at least to the military because you have some direct channels to them. So my big fear would be that this is very, very susceptible to an asymmetric effect. That just like terrorists can have a huge effect, and the cost of suppressing them is high, but we found ways to do it, right? That the information warfare adversary who doesn't mind at all cheating, lying, whatever, right, can have a huge amplified effect. In fact, that's what the Russians, with their little internet research agency, they really did it to us, right? So all the principles you've been laying out here, how do they relate to dealing with this sort of asymmetric threat?
So I think we have a particular problem in a society with the First Amendment, where we're by definition willing to let a lot more information flow. You see the debate over Facebook taking down known false ads and things like that, that we're going to have to work through. I think there's a comment that says something like, lie is halfway around the world before truth gets its pants on and out of bed. So that's going to be true anywhere. So I think one of the best things you can try to do is educate the population to be more skeptical about what they're seeing, whether it doesn't matter whether on the left or the right or whatever. You just don't have people so blindly accepting what's on the internet or what comes in their phishing thing. Is that easy? No, it's not. But I think I'm a little bit encouraged by the fact that more and more people are coming to realize that this is a serious campaign that's being waged against us. It's probably only still 5% of the population that really gets it, but hopefully you can begin to spread that kind of thinking out.
Hopefully you could get the media on your side, because it's sort of natural for them to work on, the ones that want to tell the truth, however they spin it, but true.
No, there's actually Leon Firth and Sheila Ronis are doing this very interesting project for the Rockefeller Foundation, and basically future of democracy in an age of social media and rapid change. And one of the questions is a representative democracy in fact able to begin to change fast enough to be able to address some of these problems? And
so I just wanted to recommend, along these lines, there's a great report out of RAND called the Fire Hose of Falsehood Propaganda Model.
Okay.
And that's what they name the way the Russians do their propaganda. You mentioned this, assault on truth. Basically, if you throw out a fire hose of falsehoods, no one can tell what's true anymore.
Okay. So, but to jump back one thought, so you said that there's an interesting study. Do they have any answers to that question yet? Whether we can, in fact, survive, can liberal democracies function under these constraints?
So So you're saying in the Rand report or in any of
No,
these
in the
reports?
one that, yeah, I'm.
I think the Rand report addresses that.
The sentence you gave just before Kathy gave hers, you said that this very interesting report on the question of can.
Oh, so Sheila and Leon haven't finished their report yet. They expect to have it wrapped up before the end of the year, and I look forward to seeing it.
Yeah.
I've actually been part of the working group, but I haven't seen the final report. I think the answer is going to be that with sufficient amount, I mean, part of the problem gets to really some fundamental problems in society, like whatever happened to our civics education. I mean, so you're talking about the importance of governance and the challenges to governance when in fact fewer and fewer people really understand how the government works to begin with. And so that's why, I mean, a lot of what they're talking about in several of these things is how do you get back to trying to associate the citizen with the governing system that is supposedly trying to serve them and have them understand it better, what it can and cannot do. I don't know of any easy short-term fix to that, but.
Well, my son wants me to believe that the next generation will not be so easily duped because they grow up with this threat in their life, right? I'm not sure that's true.
Well,
My daughter says the same thing, but on the other hand, she's college educated.
Yeah.
but I mean, then the other piece is, okay, but by the time the present younger generation gets acclimated to the threat, what will the new threat be?
Well, yeah,
I
that's
mean,
always true.
I mean, one of the things that people are really, really scared about for 2020 is deep fakes. We're at the stage right now where any one of us could appear as a star in a porno movie, or you could have the president talking about the value of the Green New Deal, or Vice President Biden talking about his friends in the KKK. And unless you were a particularly skilled digital forensics person, it'd be almost impossible to detect that.
So you almost need some game changers in the overall structure of information distribution to deal with this.
Probably true. Amen.
You mentioned the news media, and one issue with the news media is that their culture, inculcated over generations, is to be even-handed and fair and not to make calls and let you decide. So there's this idea that anytime we have an issue that is considered controversial, we have to invite somebody from both sides. And when one side is blatantly lying and the other side is trying to get at the truth, you get a very serious problem when you do that.
Well, one of the things that Kathleen Crowley talked about was the conditions that generate echo chambers and versus just sort of what set of values or what would cause me to reject information from this versus saying this is absolute truth and I intend on my all friends just reinforce our views up until we become convinced it's the gospel truth, whether or not it is. Anyway, thank you.
How do we overcome our reluctance, our society's reluctance to put out this information ourselves? We formed a kind of a cell in the Pentagon in the early 2000s during the Gulf War to help provide a disinformation campaign on against our adversaries, and it was quickly shut down.
Oh, and I remember I was part of that. I'm part of the fight over A.S.E. Clark and all the public affairs versus the. It's an interesting comment that Churchill talks about in war. Truth is so precious, she must be protected by a bodyguard of lies. To where we are now, that the Secretary of Defense will never lie to you as a public servant. And I'm not sure where you strike that balance. Going back to the Eisenhower quote, I mean, he's saying in 1952 that this has to be an integrated information campaign at all levels. So I think the point about skepticism is probably right. I mean, somehow we have to get to the point where if I saw it on the internet, it's got to be true. Becomes at least not the default answer, but and there are more and more tools out there that allow you to check. Part of the problem, though, is that, I mean, you've got things like Snopes and stuff like that, but those are typically manual fact-checking tools where it's maybe be a couple of days before you verify the accuracy of a statement. In the meantime, it's, Pizzagate. So I don't have an easy answer for this, except education of people that this is the world we're now living in, and recognize that whether it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on, this kind of a campaign could be mounted against your people, not just the other people, and you need to be vigilant to try to figure out what's right and what isn't.
So question regarding cyber-physical.
Yeah.
Cyber-physical
Yeah.
resiliency. So you do this comparison between security and resilience. One is you kind of protect, but then the resiliency approach is much broader. So the question, how you preserve the US economy and communities in the context when you, due to an attack or due to natural disasters, you lose not just a little bit of your capacity and resources, but a very significant number. Imagine in some areas you lose 50% of your power supply, very large numbers. What happens in this situation? So today, it seems that the system would collapse if you lose more than a certain amount of your resources. So the question is how to deal with that. And the problem seems to be very, of course, very complex, because if you look at what people do on the computational side, people design this self-healing, self-optimizing, self-configuring, self-diagnosing systems.
Right.
But this is based on the fact that you very accurately model the performance of those systems. Now, when you look at cyber-physical systems, let's say power system or energy systems, or supply chain systems, they involve many business and economic entities that you don't have visibility into. So it's completely impossible, right, to model the entire thing and try to restructure, reconfigure allocation of resources, simply because the system is completely distributed. So what's your take of how one can approach this problem?
So I think the answer is to build some excess capacity back into the system. Okay, the more that everything drives us to just-in-time logistics and zero inventories and things like that, you're going to be vulnerable to this case where a small perturbation can lead to catastrophic cascading casualties. I don't know how you get that other than the market is going to drive you to just-in-time logistics, most efficient allocation of operational resources, and so on and so forth. So I don't know if this becomes a role for the government in kind of like the banks, okay, the bank stress tests after the 2007, requiring they keep certain amounts of reserves on hand and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so we are looking at this issue, what we call resilience markets.
Yeah.
And the idea that different entities, the amount of economic impact may be drastically different.
Right.
Let's say if you, so some industries like maybe losing millions of dollars an hour.
Yeah.
If they have an outage, and some are relatively do not have a significant impact. So ideally, right, you want to redistribute it in such a way, right, that from low impacted to very high impact, and compensating the low impacted. But it requires some kind of market, right, resiliency market that works automatically at the time of happening, but preset as a kind of mitigation scheme. Or do you know of any efforts of going in this direction?
Well, so one of the points that we had in our offsite for CRAS the other day, the talk was about how to take resilience and turn it into an ROI calculation that that businesses can make informed economic decisions about resilience rather than just resilience as some kind of abstract concept. There's some data on disaster relief that says every dollar spent before disaster is worth like 4 trying to be spent during the disaster. Okay, and so can you find the insurance industry or something like that would be willing to say, look, we will give you lower insurance rates, or we will subsidize this, that, and the other thing if you take these preparations in advance that take into account some of these points you're making. I got a fascinating letter from an email from somebody last night We was talking about if the four kind of functions of our economy are investment, production, consumption, and waste. Okay, we have for 100 more years had all kinds of mathematical calculations and models to optimize production. For the past 50, 60 years, we've had pretty good models to optimize investment. Okay? Other than individual family budgeting, we've never really had good models to optimize consumption and waste. And so suppose, as you're looking at the overall economy, especially now when you've got so many people in the world and more and more middle class and so on and so forth, suppose you began to do some analysis of what the optimal consumption was from, say, the standpoint of the planet or the standpoint of whatever. And some of that could then begin to lead you to your point about, are we actually optimally consuming if we're putting all this much money into a low impact thing and not enough into a high impact thing. But so I think that the thought processes and the tools are there, but then the question in our economy is how can you get it to pay? And that's why I say I think we were trying to focus here on how can you put it in terms of return on investment calculations, where the return on investment includes the high impact but low probability events like a natural disaster or a cyber attack or something like that. So we're 3 o'clock. I'm more than happy to stay. But thank you very much. Sir, Mark.
If we could put together a proposal where we get someone from maybe psychology or sociology or someplace, and someone from BSC working through the center, like maybe our friend Alex over here, to try to come up with creative solutions, starting from where the lady at CMU left off, right? Not, don't try to reinvent that. It really needs a lot of creative thought and maybe figure out some way to do some experiments. I don't know how it would be, but
I guarantee you that folks at NASCAR would be interested in doing this. And probably Tanya Leeds, and then some of the folks at Shaw would be interested in partnering with us. So I think that's just wonderful.
I'm sorry. That's technology. I have no idea how.
I just shut up. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah.
Alex, we've been looking for a place to involve you here for a long time.
Sure. Yeah, I have some kind of idea regarding the question I asked about this resiliency market, but what you are suggesting is very interesting. It's very interesting. So if you want to influence people, right, and what the adversary may be doing, what we might be doing to an adversary, actually, right, it might be symmetric. There is a very interesting paradigm, how people do it, right? There is exploration. You have many different means, right? From whether it's Facebook and Instagram and various channels, how you distribute your efforts to get to the maximum effect you want to achieve, whether it is influence our opinion, right, or election. And then there is optimization. So if you understood and explored the space and constructed a response function, right, the next question that you are optimizing your response. So there's a kind of offensive side of that, and there's a defensive side of that, which is defensive. Not clear to me how it might work, but it's a very interesting question.
Well, we have to come back to this. I'm, after I teach today, headed out for the International Committee Symposium, so it'll be a week and a half before I could get back to it, but I think it would be, let's try to schedule a meeting where we brainstorm this some more and get somebody from one of those other 2 organizations here.
Mm-hmm.
And Kathy, I expect too. Because it's going to have to be as much CREST as anything else, probably.
Alex.
Yeah.
Alex, I'm not sure if you're aware that, so